Let's get philosophical. Critical Reflections on Conspiracy Theory. Authored by Kurtis Hagen. This bonus episode does not address conspiracy theories, at least not directly. Rather, it addresses the early Confucian perspective on war. Note, however, that there is a close connection between war and conspiracy theory. Many political conspiracy theories allege that provocations for war have been manufactured, or that the authorities are lying about the justification. Other conspiracy theories allege that an assassinated leader was killed, at least in part, due to his anti-war or insufficiently hawkish stance. Still others allege the rigging of elections that have implications for war. The following is a modified portion of an article titled Mencius and Xunzi on the Legitimate Use of Offensive Force, a pacifistic critique of recent just war interpretations, which was published in the journal Philosophy Compass, in 2022, by Kurtis Hagen. A more complete argument can be found in the middle 4 chapters of Hagen's book Lead Them with Virtue, a Confucian Alternative to War, published in 2021, by Lexington Books. For technical reasons, the Chinese name
荀字,
which is spelled Xunzi, will mostly be mispronounced Xunzi.
A defense of early Confucian pacifism. Mencius and Xunzi are the two most famous early Confucians, after Confucius himself, and we know more about their perspectives on warfare than we do about Confucius's perspective. That is why the focus here will be on them. They lived during the Warring States period, a time characterized by brutal wars of conquest. Along with their Taoist and Moist contemporaries, they expressed much antipathy toward war. Mencius, for example, describes being good at war as, quote, a great crime, unquote. And, referring to the period just before his own time, he maintains,
during the spring and autumn period there were no appropriate wars, there were only some that were better than others.
So, it is not entirely surprising that early Confucians have sometimes been read as pacifists. However, over the past couple decades, several scholars have argued that early Confucians are better viewed as just war theorists who are relatively open to the use of violence under plausible circumstances. I address the arguments of these scholars in my book, Lead Them with Virtue, a Confucian Alternative to War, and to a lesser extent in the article on which this podcast is based. For our purposes here, suffice it to say that the problem with their interpretations, in my view, is that they interpret Mencius and Xunzi as offering criteria for just war that is much too permissive, and they have an inadequate justification for this permissiveness. They dismiss statements that suggest a more pacifistic stance, perhaps because they think such statements are too naive to take seriously, and they ignore what Mencius and Xunzi are trying to do in the contexts in which they discussed war. A few words about just war theory and pacifism. According to just war theory, starting a war can be justified so long as certain criteria are met. In Western just war theory, those criteria include just cause, right intention, last resort, reasonable likelihood of success, and proportionality, that is, the good achieved should not be outweighed by the devastation caused. Such a theory could be highly restrictive or relatively permissive depending on the criteria used and how they are interpreted. In my interpretation of Mencius and Xunzi, the criteria they imply for the just use of offensive military force is so difficult to satisfy that it comes close to pacifism, at least of a weak variety. The word pacifism encompasses a spectrum of positions, from opposing any kind of violence in any situation to, more modestly, opposing offensive war in any realistically foreseeable circumstance. I argue that Mencius and Xunzi's position, in practical terms, closely approaches the more modest form of pacifism. At least, their positions are relatively pacifistic in the sense that they are closer to pacifism than recent just war interpretations recognize. These recent just war interpretations are, in contrast, relatively permissive, suggesting that war that is ostensibly motivated by humanitarian concerns is relatively easily justified. In my interpretation, the bar for justifying offensive war, even in service of humanitarian goals, is so high that, in the real world, it is attainable only in the rarest of circumstances, if at all. Xinzhong Yao's pacifistic reading. While acknowledging that war is sometimes unavoidable, Xinzhong Yao argues that
Confucians are nevertheless in line with the pacifist tradition rather than with just war theory.
Confucianism, Yao writes,
Has a fundamental inclination towards ethical pacifism, namely, taking moral influence rather than war as the solution of disorder and conflict.
But how could Confucianism's purported, fundamentally pacifist tendency be consistent with the fact, which Yao acknowledges, that the early Confucians grant the possibility of just war? Let's look more closely at what Yao is claiming. What he acknowledges, more precisely, is that early Confucians
permit or justify certain kinds of military engagement as the means of preventing chaos, liberating the people from tyranny, and restoring justice.
He must acknowledge the legitimacy of at least some military campaigns, since Mencius and Xunzi clearly signal approval of the campaigns of the ancient sage kings. However, what did those campaigns involve? Could they have been, in some reasonable sense, pacifistic? This is possible if, as Yao argues,
A true king thus triumphs without having to engage in a fight, gains his objectives without resort to force, and submits the whole world to his rule without his armies exerting themselves. This is how a war can be won without killing and suffering.
Whether or not this view is plausible, which I will address later, there is, at least, strong textual support that both Mencius and Xunzi did assert it. When discussing semi-mythic cases of appropriate military interventions, both Mencius and Xunzi present rather idealized depictions. Mencius depicts the situation as a supremely good true king, who is therefore universally supported, against a tyrant, who is therefore hated. If a true king were to conduct punitive expeditions against states that drown their own people, Mencius asks, who would treat him as an enemy? For example, when the sage king Tang launched a punitive expedition against Go, according to Mencius, quote, the whole world trusted him, unquote. Indeed, Mencius repeatedly remarks, quote, those of genuine humanity have no enemies, unquote. Mencius implies that when the great kings Tang and Wu won over the people of the world, they did it with the potency of their virtue. They did not need to use force because, when one relies on virtue, quote, the people are joyful in their hearts and submit sincerely, just as Confucius's 70 followers submitted to him, unquote. In one significant passage, Mencius concludes,
To punish militarily means to set straight. If each desires to set themselves straight, what need is there for war?
Regarding the relative nonviolence involved in the justified use of the military, Xunzi is clearer and more explicit than Mencius. Xunzi writes, for example,
Yao toppled Huangdo, Xun toppled the rulers of the Miao, Yu toppled the Gonggong, Tong toppled the ruler of the Shao dynasty, King Wen toppled Chong, and King Wu toppled Zhou. Their armies did not bloody their swords, for both far and near willingly submitted.
Regarding punitive expeditions generally, Xunzi explains, quote, the military forces of true kings are not put to the test, unquote. He then provides these examples.
In Tang's and Wu's punishments of the tyrants, Jie and Zhou, they merely clasped their hands, bowed, and then gestured a command with their fingers. And none of the mighty and aggressive states failed to hurriedly enable it. Punishing Jie and Zhou was like punishing solitary individuals.
Xunzi elsewhere describes the Duke of Zhou's campaign against the tyrant Zhou Xin as follows: the army advanced, the enemy fled, and the men of Yin themselves put Zhou Xin to death. Xunzi remarks,
There was no taking of heads or captives and no rewards for daring and difficult feats.
In a note to his translation, John Knobloch writes, quote, since there was no fighting, there was no cause to reward bravery on the battlefield, unquote. In general, if a battle would be required, that is a signal that attacking is not justified. Xunzi writes,
When cities are defended, a true king does not attack. Against a well-formed army, he does not strike.
Elsewhere he explains,
A true king could surely defeat his opponent in battle, but would be ashamed to participate in fighting. He unassumingly achieves civil accomplishments for the world to see, and aggressive states peacefully transform themselves.
He also writes,
A true king is unopposed. And by virtue of the Tao of protecting and serving the people, he is victorious without battles, and gains territory without attacking, for the whole world submits without armor and weaponry being put to work.
The general guiding principle is expressed in an ancient saying, which Xunzi quotes.
The exemplary person uses virtue, the petty person uses force.
Although Confucius's view of war is less clear than that of Mencius and Xunzi, the strategy implied above seems consistent both with Confucius's stress on the transformative power of benevolent governance and of serving as an exemplary role model. There are many relevant passages, but I will here quote only one. In Allege 16.1, after suggesting that governments should focus on making the people content and harmonious, as well as ensuring an equitable distribution of wealth, Confucius remarks,
If distant peoples do not accede, cultivate your civil virtues to thereby attract them. Once drawn in, ensure they are content.
This is essentially the approach that Mencius calls returning to the fundamental, namely, governing in a way that expresses benevolence. Thus, the pacifistic interpretation of Mencius and Xunzi not only is supported by the most relevant textual evidence, it also coheres with a core Confucian commitment to the transformative power of virtue. Just war pacifism. Julia Ching has suggested that early Confucians could be considered, quote, just war pacifists, unquote. It may well be that Mencius and Xunzi are best interpreted as implying just war criteria with pacifistic intent. Mencius and Xunzi aim to steer rulers away from war and toward self-improvement, and toward governing their own people more benevolently. Their strategy, it seems, was to contrast the situations of their day with idealized semi-mythic cases involving true kings whose moral authority was so great that, 1. The people of the intervened state overwhelmingly welcomed the intervention, 2. The leaders of all the neighboring states approved of and facilitated it, and 3. These factors were so powerful that little significant fighting needed to take place. There were, as Xunzi put it, punishments but no battles. Idealized instances of just wars were used to show that war in the present situation would not be just. Punitive expeditions that were justified would be, quote, like punishing solitary individuals, unquote. However, real cases fail to meet these standards. As Ching remarks,
we should remember that the ancients attributed such punitive wars to semi-legendary sage kings. I do not think the Confucian tradition would support today's world powers in arrogating such prerogatives to themselves.
Yao also makes this point, writing,
Confucian said that there might be some wars that were just unnecessary, but, on the other hand, all the cases that were presented had happened only in the remote and idealist past.
By implication, Yao suggests, in the real world all wars were unjustifiable aggressive wars. Rather than insisting that Confucianism should not be thought of in a just war theory framework, Yao could have framed his interpretation as just war pacifism. After all, he states that
Confucians argue that a just war is the one that wins without fighting and killing.
There is a sense, however, in which it does seem fair to deny that Confucians were just war thinkers at all. According to conflict studies scholar Richard Jackson, just war theory
starts with the question, under what conceivable circumstances is it legitimate for states to use violent force as a political means?
In contrast, he writes,
a pacifist approach starts by asking, what is the most effective and ethical thing to do in response to a threat in a specific cultural historical context?
The latter question seems to better capture the Confucian approach. Mencius and Xunzi were not trying to articulate when violence is legitimate, they were trying to steer rulers toward self-cultivation, and toward more benevolent governance, so as to make violence unnecessary. Does a pacifistic reading of Mencius and Xunzi treat them as naive? First, pacifism should not be simply assumed to be naive. After all, there are few cases in which war genuinely improved things, despite optimistic promises. And the surprising successes of some nonviolent movements seems to suggest that idealism is not always merely idealistic. The civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King in the United States, the Indian independence movement led by Gandhi, the South African overturning of apartheid, and the Danish resistance to the Nazis are a few notable examples. Second, Mencius and Xunzi were using exaggerated rhetoric as a way of encouraging more ethical behavior, wiser courses of action, and more benevolent policies. That is not necessarily a sign of naivete. If they thought that self-cultivation and benevolent governance would make problems disappear simply and easily, then that would be naive. But it is not clear that they thought this. If their position, rather, is that focusing on ethical and compassionate conduct in governance is the best long-term approach, which is how I read them, then it is not clear that their position is naive. Indeed, I would suggest that that position deserves serious consideration. By long-term approach, I mean that rather than gambling on a violent quick fix to a foreign problem, a wise ruler would focus on ameliorating the problems in his own state, as well as assisting the people of other states, to the degree possible, in any peaceful way that is feasible and would be universally approved. In the contemporary world that may involve making vitamins, medicines, and mosquito nets available where they are in need, helping poor rural communities build water collection facilities and water pumps, and providing access to low-cost microloans. In this way one builds up the credibility required to, in very rare cases, intervene in ways that do not devolve into an ever-worsening calamity. After all, so long as the morally unproblematic steps to enact benevolent policies are not being taken to the degree that they could be, how can one claim the moral authority to help people with violence? This approach is not expected to solve all crises, at least not quickly. But it recognizes that not all crises can be fixed quickly, there are many problems besides the crisis of the moment that can be ameliorated, and that there are dynamics that play out over time that need to be taken into consideration. For example, when one takes the long view, one takes into consideration the possible vicious cycles that violence tends to involve. As conflict studies scholar Richard Jackson notes,
in employing violence to protect a group of innocent people in the present, for example, the long-term effects will be to reinforce the discourses and psychological mechanisms that encourage future resorts to violence and the entrenchment of an ongoing cycle of violence.
Confucians were concerned about such dynamics and advocated following reliable strategies rather than taking risks. Confucians believed that following Tao was the best way to achieve and maintain a peaceful, harmonious world. Deviations from it, including the need to rely significantly on violence because one's ability to persuade was inadequate, tends to erode the conditions upon which peace and harmony depend. As Yao puts it,
The way is both the prerequisite and the guarantee of a harmonious world, a peaceful society and a good life, and without it the transformation of the universe would break down, human society disintegrate, the state be weakened and the world fall into chaos.
This is not an unreasonable concern, even if presented in exaggerated terms. Nor are such views held only by Confucians. For example, in Evil, Inside Human Cruelty and Violence, Roy Baumeister argues,
when people believe firmly that they are on the side of the good, and are working to make the world a better place, they often feel justified in using strong measures against the seemingly evil forces that oppose them. Noble ends are often seen as justifying violent means. In reality, such means often discredit and contaminate the noble goals, but this outcome is rarely anticipated. Group competition can evolve into brutal conflict in which each side sincerely sees itself as the good guys who need to take strong measures to defeat the forces of evil that oppose them.
One who appreciates such dynamics, at least arguably, is less naive than one who maintains that peace can be secured through violence. For this and similar reasons, just war theory can also be accused of making naive assumptions, including, as Jackson puts it,
naive assumptions about violence, namely, that violence can be used as a tool or instrument by states that then remain unaffected by participating in violence.
It is noteworthy in this context that the Taoist philosopher Laozi was particularly sensitive to the way complex dynamics could serve to thwart one's intentions. By striving for self-aggrandizement, for example, one unintentionally courts ruin. More generally, on Laozi's view, taking dramatic action to fix a problematic situation is dangerous, and likely to achieve the opposite of what is desired. Mencius and Xunzi were also sensitive to relevant dynamics by which one could unintentionally undermine one's own purposes. Xunzi, for example, details the negative feedback loops involved in attempting to use military strength in the face of resistance. And Mencius recognized, quote, "If you kill someone's brother, someone will likewise kill your brother," unquote. To dissuade rulers from engaging in warfare, Mencius appealed to idealized cases and drew contrasts. He thereby tried to reorient the ruler away from military ambitions to moral ones, focusing on self-cultivation and benevolent governance. It does not seem implausible that he might succeed in dissuading rulers from engaging in wars that would likely be self-destructive as well as calamitous for soldiers and civilians alike. And it is not implausible that he could have had some influence on them regarding self-improvement and instituting more humane policies. If he achieved desirable results, even if imperfectly, it does not seem that his approach was unreasonable or overly idealistic. And the general theory is probably true to some extent. Positive moral example does have salutary downstream impacts such that conflicts are reduced and some amount of aggression is avoided. It may be that consistently following the Confucian approach really is better than going to war whenever it seems like that might be the best course of action. For even if that assessment is occasionally right, it may more commonly be disastrously wrong. I conclude that there is strong textual evidence supporting a pacifistic interpretation of Mencius and Xunzi, and that their pacifistic position is not naive.
You have been listening to a modified portion of an article entitled Mencius and Xunzi on the Legitimate Use of Offensive Force, a Pacifistic Critique of Recent Just War Interpretations, which was published in the journal Philosophy Compass, in 2022, by Kurtis Hagen. For a more elaborated argument, see Lead Them with Virtue, a Confucian Alternative to War, published in 2021, by Lexington Books.